Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the connections between classic literature and contemporary American politics.
Yeah.
You've provided us with excerpts from an academic paper,
Right.
Lord of the Flies, and Contemporary American Politics, a parallel study of human nature and governance.
It's always fascinating to see how fiction can offer insights into human behavior and societal structures.
Absolutely. Lord of the Flies, for those unfamiliar,
Right.
tells a story of British schoolboys stranded on an island during wartime.
Yeah.
Their attempt to establish a society ultimately collapses into savagery.
Right.
And this paper
Yes.
argues that this fictional scenario has some unsettling parallels
Yeah.
to the current political climate in the United States.
The paper's premise is that certain trends in American politics, particularly in recent years,
Right.
mirror the breakdown of order and trust.
Right.
That's so central to Golding's novel.
One of the first points that the paper raises is how the boys' initial attempts at creating order ultimately fail.
Right.
They establish rules.
Yeah.
Symbolized by the conch shell,
Right.
which represents democratic principles and reasoned discourse.
Yeah.
But as fear and division grow,
Right.
that system crumbles.
The conch,
Right.
initially granting the right to speak and be heard,
Mm-hmm.
embodies the very essence of a functioning democracy.
Yes.
Its destruction,
Yeah.
alongside Piggy's death,
Right.
marks a symbolic collapse of their attempt
Yeah.
at a civilized society.
Right.
The paper connects this to events in contemporary American politics, particularly the increasing questioning of election legitimacy,
Right.
which has had a similar corrosive effect on public trust in institutions.
And that erosion of trust is a key point, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
The paper argues that this distrust, fueled in part by the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories,
Right.
undermines the very foundation of a democratic society.
Think of it this way.
Okay. Democracy relies on a shared understanding of reality,
Yeah.
a basic agreement on facts and processes.
Right.
When that shared understanding erodes,
Yes.
it becomes incredibly difficult to address complex challenges that require collective action.
The paper then goes on to discuss this concept of tribalism and polarization, which is so vividly depicted in Lord of the Flies.
Right.
The boys split into factions.
Yeah.
Ralph's group focused on rescue and maintaining order,
Hmm.
and Jack's group
Right.
drawn to hunting and a more primal form of power.
This division into us versus them
Right.
is where the real danger lies. It leads to the dehumanization of the other,
Yes.
making violence and cruelty not only possible, but almost inevitable.
Right.
The paper argues that we're seeing a similar intensification of political polarization in the United States,
Yeah.
particularly around the 2024 election.
Social media, with its echo chambers and algorithms that reinforce existing beliefs.
Right. Seems to be playing a significant role in this trend.
Absolutely. Social media often creates a distorted reality.
Yes.
Where people are exposed primarily to information that confirms their pre-existing biases.
Right.
This makes it incredibly difficult
Yeah.
to have constructive conversations across ideological divides and even harder to find common ground.
The paper then delves into
Yes.
the contrasting leadership styles
Yes.
represented by Ralph and Jack, drawing parallels to contemporary political figures.
This is where the analysis gets particularly interesting.
Okay.
Ralph focused on collective well-being
Yeah.
and long-term goals, like maintaining the signal fire for rescue.
Right.
Embodies a more reasoned and collaborative approach to leadership.
Yeah.
He prioritizes the needs of the group over individual desires.
Jack, on the other hand,
Right.
represents a more authoritarian and
Yeah.
power-hungry style of leadership.
Yeah.
He manipulates the boys' fears and desires,
Right.
prioritizing immediate gratification and dominance over the group's long-term survival.
The paper suggests that these contrasting approaches to leadership
Yeah.
are reflected in contemporary American politics,
Right.
where some figures emphasize unity and democratic principles,
Right.
while others leverage fear and division to consolidate their power.
The 2024 election certainly highlighted
Yeah.
these contrasting approaches with candidates representing a
Yeah.
wide spectrum of leadership styles
Yeah.
and political ideologies.
And this brings us to another crucial point the paper raises.
It's okay.
The role of fear as a political tool.
Yeah.
Just as Jack exploits the boy's fear of the beast to solidify his control, the paper argues that contemporary politicians often use fear to advance their agendas and gain support for policies that might otherwise be resisted.
It's a tactic that has been used throughout history by appealing to people's anxieties about security, economic stability, or social change. Leaders can create a climate of fear that makes it easier to justify actions that might erode democratic norms or individual liberties.
The paper specifically highlights how certain candidates in the 2024 election tapped into existing anxieties about issues like immigration, economic uncertainty, and national security to mobilize their base and justify their proposed policies.
It's not about the validity of these issues themselves, but the way they are framed and the emotional responses they're intended to evoke.
Fear can be a powerful motivator. And when manipulated effectively, it can be used to bypass critical thinking and rational debate.
This manipulation of fears is often accompanied by a decline in civility and an increase in aggressive rhetoric.
This is a point the paper explores in some detail. It draws a direct parallel between the boy's descent into savagery and Lord of the Flies, marked by the abandonment of structured meetings and the embrace of violent rituals, and the decline of civil discourse in American politics.
We've seen a troubling increase in instances of political violence, threats against public officials, and heightened tensions during campaigns and elections. The 2024 election cycle, unfortunately, provided numerous examples of this trend.
The paper argues that this decline in civility is a direct threat to the functioning of a democratic society.
Civility and respect are essential for maintaining a space where reasoned debate and compromise are possible.
When these qualities erode, it becomes increasingly difficult to find common ground and work together to address complex challenges.
The paper suggests that this trend is further exacerbated by the nature of contemporary media, particularly the role of social media in shaping perceptions and controlling narratives.
Just as Jack, in Lord of the Flies, manipulates the boy's perception of reality, using fear and propaganda to gain obedience, the paper argues that modern media, particularly social media, can be used to shape public opinion and control the flow of information.
It's about recognizing the tactics being used and understanding how they impact our understanding of the world around us.
And that's where media literacy becomes crucial. It's about developing the critical thinking skills to evaluate information sources, recognize biases, and be wary of narratives that seem designed to provoke strong emotional responses without necessarily presenting a balanced or accurate view of reality.
It's about becoming more conscious consumers of information and recognizing the ways in which we might be manipulated by the information we consume.
The paper goes on to discuss how the rise of misinformation, echo chambers, and conspiracy theories has made it increasingly difficult to discern truth from falsehood. And how these trends have played a significant role in shaping the political landscape in the United States.
And this brings us back to the core of what the paper is attempting to do. Highlight the unsettling parallels between a fictional story of boys on an island and the very real challenges facing American democracy today.
It's a call to recognize the potential for darkness that exists within all human societies, and to be vigilant in safeguarding the values and institutions that protect us from our own worst impulses.
Absolutely.
The paper then kind of delves deeper into this notion of trust, arguing that the boys' initial faith in the conch as a symbol of order and democracy, mirrors the trust that citizens place in their institutions.
And just as that faith crumbles in the novel, the paper points to a similar decline in trust towards institutions like the government, the media, even the electoral process in the United States.
You can see how this connects back to the earlier discussion about misinformation and polarization. The paper suggests that the proliferation of conspiracy theories, particularly around events like the 2020 and 2024 elections, further erodes public trust and makes it easier for individuals to dismiss information that challenges their worldview.
It becomes a vicious cycle.
It does.
Distrust fuels the spread of misinformation.
Exactly.
Which in turn further deepens that distrust.
Right.
It's like a societal immune system breaking down.
Yes.
Leaving us vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the paper argues that this breakdown of trust makes it incredibly difficult to address the complex challenges. Facing society challenges that often require collective action and a shared understanding of reality.
Because if you don't trust the institutions responsible for gathering information, making decisions, implementing solutions, how can you effectively address problems like climate change, economic inequality, or public health crises?
The paper uses the descent into chaos in Lord of the Flies. As a cautionary tale, it reminds us that when trust in institutions collapses, it can create a vacuum where fear and division thrive, paving the way for more authoritarian forms of leadership.
This brings us to the paper's analysis of the psychological underpinnings of fear and how it can be used as a tool of manipulation.
The Beast in Lord of the Flies is a brilliant literary device that embodies this concept. It's never actually seen, but constantly feared, representing those primal anxieties that lurk beneath the surface of human consciousness.
And Jack masterfully exploits that fear, doesn't he?
He does.
He positions himself as the protector, the one who can provide security in the face of this unseen threat. It's a classic tactic that's been used by leaders throughout history.
Think about it. When people feel threatened or uncertain, they become more susceptible to messages that offer simple solutions. Even if those solutions involve surrendering freedoms or accepting a narrative that demonizes the other.
The paper argues that we see this dynamic playing out in contemporary American politics as well.
Absolutely. Issues like immigration, economic instability, and national security are often framed in ways that evoke fear and anxiety, creating a sense of urgency and a perceived need for strong leadership to address these threats.
And in this climate of fear, it becomes easier to justify policies that might otherwise be met with resistance, policies that could curtail civil liberties or limit democratic processes in the name of security or stability.
The paper provides some specific examples from the 2024 election cycle where candidates use this tactic effectively, tapping into anxieties about social change, economic hardship, and perceived threats to national identity to mobilize their base.
It's a manipulation of our natural instincts for survival and security. And the paper emphasizes how this can be used to undermine democratic principles and consolidate power.
Moving on from the psychological aspects of fear, the paper also draws a parallel between the boys' descent into savagery and the alarming decline of civil discourse in American politics.
This is a trend we've all witnessed in recent years.
Well, we have.
The increasing polarization, the hostility towards opposing viewpoints, the erosion of respect for those who hold different political beliefs. It's as if we've forgotten how to disagree without resorting to personal attacks or demonizing the other.
The paper argues that this decline in civility is a direct threat to the functioning of a democracy. Because it makes meaningful dialogue and compromise almost impossible.
When reasoned debate is replaced by shouting matches and ad hominem attacks, finding common ground and working together to address complex challenges becomes an insurmountable task.
And the 2024 election cycle was unfortunately a prime example of this trend, with candidates and their supporters often engaging in highly divisive and inflammatory rhetoric.
The paper suggests that social media plays a significant role in this dynamic.
Absolutely.
By creating echo chambers, where individuals are primarily exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs. This leads to a distorted view of reality.
It does.
Where opposing viewpoints are demonized. And any attempt at constructive dialogue is met with hostility.
It's like we're living in separate realities. Each with its own set of facts and its own interpretation of truth. And this makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to bridge the divide and find common ground.
This inability to engage in civil discourse has real-world consequences.
It does.
The paper points to events like the January 6th Capitol riot as a stark example of what can happen when misinformation, political polarization, and the erosion of trust reach a boiling point.
It's a sobering reminder that the fragility of democracy is not just a theoretical concept, but a very real and present danger.
Right.
And the events of recent years, both in the United States and around the world, underscore this point.
The paper then turns to the question of what we can learn from Lord of the Flies and how these lessons might be applied to the current political landscape.
It's a call to recognize the darker aspects of human nature and the ease with which order can descend into chaos.
Right.
It's a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport.
Yeah.
It requires active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to defend the values and institutions that underpin a free and just society.
The paper suggests that one of the most crucial lessons we can take away from Lord of the Flies is the importance of civil discourse.
Right.
We need to find ways to bridge the ideological divide and relearn the art of respectful disagreement.
This means being willing to listen to and consider perspectives that challenge our own, to engage in dialogue with those who hold different views, and to recognize that common ground often exists even amidst deep disagreements.
It also means being mindful of the language we use, avoiding personal attacks and inflammatory rhetoric that only serve to further divide us.
And it requires us to be discerning consumers of information, to develop the skills to recognize misinformation and propaganda, and to be willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions.
The paper argues that this requires a conscious effort to seek out diverse perspectives, to engage in critical thinking, and to be wary of information that confirms our existing beliefs without question.
It's about recognizing that truth is often complex and nuanced. And that it rarely fits neatly into the narratives presented to us through our curated media feeds.
And this brings us to the paper's analysis of the role of media and control in shaping perceptions and influencing behavior. Which mirrors Jack's manipulation of the boys through fear and propaganda in Lord of the Flies. It's fascinating how the paper connects this idea of media manipulation to the events in Lord of the Flies. Jack effectively controls the narrative on the island, using fear of the beast and the promise of security to maintain his power.
It's a brilliant parallel. Just as Jack distorts reality to suit his purposes. The paper argues that contemporary media can be used in similar ways to shape perceptions and influence public opinion. This is particularly relevant in the age of social media, where algorithms often prioritize engagement over accuracy, leading to the spread of sensationalized or misleading content.
We've all seen how quickly misinformation can spread online.
We have.
Often amplified by echo chambers and filter bubbles that reinforce existing biases. This makes it increasingly difficult to discern fact from fiction. And creates a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and distrust in legitimate sources of information.
The paper highlights how this dynamic played out in the 2024 election. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for information warfare, with various actors using manipulative tactics to sway public opinion and undermine their opponents. These tactics included spreading disinformation, using bots to amplify certain messages, and creating fake accounts to sow discord and division.
It's like a digital version of the tribalism we see in Lord of the Flies.
It is.
Where the boys' fears and prejudices are exploited to turn them against each other.
Precisely. And the consequences of this online manipulation can be just as real and damaging as the physical violence we see in the novel. The paper argues that the erosion of trust, the rise of extremism, and the increasing polarization of society are all, in part, fueled by this manipulation of information online.
So how do we combat this? How do we become more discerning consumers of information and resist these manipulative tactics?
The paper emphasizes the importance of media literacy. It's about developing the critical thinking skills necessary to evaluate information sources, recognize biases, and understand the motivations behind the information we consume.
It's about being skeptical of information that confirms our existing beliefs without question.
It is.
And seeking out diverse perspectives to gain a more complete understanding of complex issues.
Media literacy also involves understanding how algorithms and social media platforms work.
Yeah.
How they filter and curate the information we see.
Right.
And how they can be used to manipulate our emotions and behavior.
It's about being aware of the tactics used by those who seek to control the narrative.
It is.
Such as using emotionally charged language, spreading misinformation, and creating false dichotomies to simplify complex issues.
It's also about recognizing our own biases.
Right.
And the ways in which they might influence our interpretation of information.
Yes.
We all have preconceived notions and worldviews that shape how we see the world. And it's important to be aware of these biases so that we can approach information with a critical and discerning eye.
The paper argues that by developing media literacy skills, we can become more resilient to manipulation and misinformation.
Right.
We can learn to identify false narratives, recognize propaganda techniques, and seek out reliable sources of information to form our own informed opinions.
This empowerment is crucial for the health of a democratic society.
It is.
An informed and engaged citizenry is less susceptible to manipulation and better equipped to participate in constructive dialogue and decision-making.
The paper ultimately argues that the parallels between Lord of the Flies and contemporary American politics serve as a stark warning about the fragility of civilization and the dangers of unchecked fear, tribalism, and the erosion of trust. It's a call to action.
It is.
To be more vigilant, to engage in critical thinking, and to actively work to uphold the values that underpin a free and just society.
It's a reminder that the choices we make, both individually and collectively, have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
Just as the boys on the island face the ramifications of their descent into savagery, so too do we face the consequences of our actions and inactions in the political realm.
The future of our democracy depends on our collective commitment.
It does.
To upholding democratic principles.
Yes.
Engaging in civil discourse and recognizing our shared humanity even in the face of disagreement.
As we conclude this deep dive, we encourage you to reflect on the insights from the paper and consider how its themes resonate in today's world.
Absolutely.
Look for examples of how fear and tribalism are used to gain power and influence. Consider the role of media in shaping perceptions and controlling narratives. And most importantly, think about how you as an individual can contribute to a more civil, informed, and engaged society.
This has been a really fascinating discussion.
It has.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Yes.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.